My name is Cassidy Lane. I was 36 years old, 11 weeks pregnant, and standing on a rooftop terrace in Nashville, Tennessee, the night my mother-in-law looked at me in front of 40 people and called my baby a financial scheme. I had practiced 2 words the entire drive over. We're expecting. I never got to say them the way I'd planned. Diane looked at my husband, then turned to me slowly, the way someone looks when they've already made up their mind and are just waiting for you to confirm it. And then she said the thing that this family would spend the next year and a half trying to bury. What she did in the 90 seconds after that put me in Vanderbilt Medical Center, and it put every single one of them somewhere a whole lot worse. Welcome to Silent Revenge. I'm Cassidy. And this is one of those stories that will make you want to call your best friend, lock your documents in a folder, and trust the process even when the process is slow. If any part of what I'm about to tell you sounds familiar, if you've ever been dismissed, doubted, or pushed past your limit by someone who thought money could protect them from the truth, you are exactly where you're supposed to be right now. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I genuinely read them. And hit subscribe because where this story goes next, you are not going to want to miss it. Let me tell you who I actually was before that rooftop, because Diane's version of me was a fiction she'd written before we ever met. I'm a forensic accountant. Have been for 11 years. I investigate fraud, insurance schemes, embezzlement, financial crimes that end in federal court. My job is to find the lie inside the numbers, and I have been very, very good at it since before I turned 30. I document everything. Call logs, email timestamps, transaction trails, meeting notes, all of it in order with dates. It is not a personality type. It is the skill that pays my mortgage. And I bought that mortgage myself. My house in East Nashville, 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a front porch that tilts just enough to remind you who built it. I bought it at 28 on my own salary, 6 years of careful saving, no cosigner, no family money, no shortcuts. I have never in my adult life asked anyone for anything I didn't earn first. I met Whitmore at a charity auction I almost skipped. He was across the room, laughing a little too loud at something one of his friends said, and somehow instead of being annoying it was charming. He texted good morning the next day before I'd even started my coffee. He remembered how I took it, oat milk, no sugar, the second time we met. We got married 2 years later in my backyard, string lights I strung myself, food from a barbecue joint I'd loved since college, and I kept my last name. That last part mattered to me. It was like keeping a receipt. Proof of the woman who'd built something before any of this. Ethan's family had money. Old Nashville money, the kind that never announces itself because it's been there long enough that it doesn't have to. The Whitmore family trust held roughly $12 million, and Diane, 59 years old, silver-haired, the kind of woman who rearranges the energy of every room she walks into, was the sole trustee. Ethan's father, Ronald, 62, was a retired civil engineer who had spent decades mastering the art of nodding at whatever his wife said. Ethan's younger sister, Kendall, 31, was a real estate agent who did maybe 2 deals a year and spent the rest of her time tending to her position within the family's orbit. And Ethan, 38, ran a small construction firm that survived, as I gradually came to understand, largely on loans from the trust whenever a project ran over. Before the wedding, Ronald asked to meet with both of us. Prenuptial agreement. Trust assets stay Whitmore, no exceptions, no gray areas. I signed it the same afternoon. I almost smiled doing it. I had my own house and my own income and no interest in their $12 million. Sign it twice if it helps anyone rest easier, I told him. Ethan looked embarrassed. Diane looked satisfied, the careful, composed satisfaction of a woman who had just confirmed something she already believed but hadn't said out loud. I filed my copy in the same accordion folder where I keep my CPA license and my property deed. 3 documents, all mine, all earned. I thought it was just good organization. Turned out to be the foundation of everything. Diane was always polite to me. Precisely polite, the specific kind of politeness that is really just surveillance with better posture. I told myself it was a Southern old money thing. I told myself it was nothing personal. I kept telling myself that right up until I got pregnant, and then polite grew edges I couldn't explain away anymore. I found out on a Thursday. I took the test in the bathroom at my office between client calls because I'd been feeling off for 2 weeks and I finally just needed to know one way or the other. 2 lines. I sat on the floor of that bathroom stall for a solid 5 minutes crying the silent kind of tears, the kind that are too real to share with anyone in the next stall. At 11 weeks I went in for my first scan. Technician angled the screen toward me and there it was, a heartbeat at 162 beats a minute, moving like it was already in a hurry to get somewhere. She printed me a photo, small and grainy, my name and the date stamped in the corner. I held it on the steering wheel at a red light on the drive home and I said out loud, to a 2-inch piece of paper, "Hey, I've got you." I tucked it into the inner zip pocket of my bag, the one I never lose anything from, and I didn't tell a soul except Ethan. He cried. Both hands over his mouth, the real kind of tears that you don't perform. We decided to announce it at Diane's 59th birthday dinner the following Saturday. The Monarch Hotel, downtown Nashville, rooftop terrace with a view of the river. Ethan said his mother loved a big occasion. I wanted to believe that bringing her a grandchild would finally shift the temperature in the room when she looked at me. There was one moment that week that should have told me something was already in motion. I ran into Kendall at the farmer's market on Wednesday. I mentioned I was looking forward to the party. She went completely still, the kind of still that isn't natural, that someone practiced. Then she smiled with just her mouth and said, "You always know how to make things about yourself, Cass." I replayed that sentence the whole drive home. I almost brought it up to Ethan. Instead, I talked myself out of it. I was 11 weeks pregnant and reading shadows into everything. I had good news. I thought good news was something you could simply hand to people. The Monarch's rooftop seated about 40. Glass railings on 3 sides, string lights overhead, and along the south edge, a low stone garden wall, the kind that's decorative, not protective, where the terrace dropped away to a lower patio 12 feet below, ringed by sculpted hedges and a small fountain. I noticed it the way I notice financial risk in a spreadsheet, automatically, quietly filed away. I didn't think about it again. Party was 40 people. Extended family, a few of Ronald's colleagues, women from Diane's social circle, a string quartet set up near the bar. My best friend from work, Priya Okafor, forensic accountant, my office partner for 6 years, the most unflappable person I know, came as my guest. Diane met me at the elevator with a hug that didn't quite connect. "Cassidy," she said, "the way you say a name when you're really saying something else." I handed her a bottle of the Sonoma Pinot Noir she'd mentioned specifically at Christmas. She set it on the drink cart without looking at the label. Across the terrace I spotted Diane and Kendall at the bar, heads tilted together, talking fast and low, the body language of 2 people finalizing something. When I walked over, they both straightened at the exact same moment, the way people do when the topic of the conversation just showed up. Kendall smoothed her dress. Diane switched on the wide social smile. 2 minutes later, Priya appeared at my elbow and said quietly, "They rehearsed something just now." I told her she was imagining things. I was good at that. Explaining things away. Right up until I couldn't anymore. Ethan found me near the bar and pressed a sparkling water into my hand. "After the toast," he whispered, his eyes already wet at the edges. I had the photo in my bag and the words ready in my throat. Cake came out at 9 o'clock. Diane made her wish. Quartet played. Ethan tapped his glass and the whole terrace went quiet, the way a room does when it senses something real is coming. He looked at me and his voice cracked when he said it. "We're going to have a baby." For one perfect second, it was everything I'd hoped for. Someone gasped. Cousins started clapping. Priya actually pumped her fist in the air. And then Diane set her champagne glass down on the railing with a single clean click, and 40 people heard it. She looked at Ethan first, then at me. Slow, deliberate, the way you study a document you already suspect is fraudulent. And she said it loud enough that nobody on that terrace had to strain to hear. "There is no baby." A beat. Only a strategy. Quartet stopped mid-note. Someone's fork hovered halfway to their mouth and stayed there. I laughed, one involuntary disbelieving sound because I thought I'd misheard. I hadn't. Diane turned to face the room like a woman delivering a verdict. My son is worth $12 million, she said, and suddenly there is a pregnancy that nobody has heard about until tonight. How convenient. Real love doesn't need a trust fund to appear. Ethan said, Mom, stop. But it came out wrong. Too small. A boy's voice reaching for a man's. I felt the photo in my bag like it had weight. I wanted to pull it out right then. The steady, professional part of me, the part that stays flat in a crisis, the part that has sat across from fraudsters who were absolutely certain they were untouchable, said quietly, Not here. Not like this. Don't give her the scene she's already built. I am 11 weeks pregnant, I said. I have a heartbeat on a screen. I have a picture of it in my bag. Diane walked toward me. Not rushed, deliberate the way she did everything. And what I couldn't process was that her face wasn't angry. She looked certain. Righteous. Like a woman who had seen this exact play before and was finally in a position to stop it. She dropped her voice as she got closer, which was worse because the room leaned in to hear. You have been working your way into this family since the day you two met, she said. The careful little accountant with her careful little paper trail. Her eyes moved to my bag. If there is a baby, show us. Prove it. Right now, in front of everyone. I had backed up against the garden wall. The stone caught me behind the knees. Priya was pushing through the crowd toward me. I could see her over Diane's shoulder. Ronald said, Diane, enough, in the tone of a man who had been saying that sentence for 30 years without once acting on it. Ethan stood frozen between his mother and his wife. I counted later, 9 seconds. He stood there for 9 full seconds and chose nothing. There is a heartbeat, I said, keeping every syllable flat and clear, and you will meet that child whether you apologize tonight or not. Dan's jaw tightened. She reached toward my bag. I think in that moment she only meant to take it to pull out the photo herself to win the argument with her own hands. But she shoved instead. Both palms straight into my chest, hard. The stone wall caught me behind the knees and I went over it. Stay right there. I need you to hear what happened next because it matters more than the fall. I did not fall 12 stories. The family spent the next 4 months trying to make the height the whole story. I went over the garden wall and dropped 12 feet onto the lower patio, onto the sculpted hedges and the stone edging around the fountain. 12 feet is not a story. It is enough. I landed on my left side. My wrist hit the stone first and broke on impact, a sharp crack I heard before I felt it. My ribs hit the fountain border and every bit of air I had left my body at once. I lay there staring up at the terrace lights, unable to pull a single breath in, and the only thought in my head, the only one, was the photo. The heartbeat. The 162 beats a minute that didn't know any of this was happening. Above me the terrace erupted. Voices. Chair going over. Ethan appeared at the top of the wall and I will give him this, he didn't take the stairs. He climbed down the side of that stone wall with his bare hands like a man who finally understood what he'd done by doing nothing, and he reached me first. Don't move, he kept saying. Don't move, please, the baby. He was crying too hard to dial. Priya came down the proper stairs at a dead run, dropped to her knees next to me, and went immediately into the steadiest voice I have ever heard from someone who was not trained for emergencies. Cassidy. I'm right here. Can you breathe? Talk to me. She had 2 fingers on my pulse and her eyes scanning my whole body. I got 1 sentence out before I heard the sirens. The photo, I said. Inside zip pocket. She did not ask a single question. She reached into my bag, pulled out that small grainy square, smudged now from the stone dust, and held it up so it was the first thing I could clearly see. Right here, she said. Both of you. Hold on. I knew the hospital they took me to. I'd done consulting work there. There is a particular kind of dread in being the patient in a building you understand because you know which silences are fine and which ones aren't. They took me straight to OB triage, which told me the intake nurse had read my chart and made a decision. Tech wrapped my left wrist. Cast, plaster, palm to mid-forearm, 6 weeks minimum. My fingers pale and numb at the end of something I suddenly couldn't use. But that cast was about to become the one piece of evidence in this whole situation that nobody could argue away. The doctor pressed the Doppler low on my belly. The room went still. A long second of nothing. And then, a sound like a tiny drumline, fast and absolutely certain of itself, 163 beats a minute, working like it had somewhere important to be. I cried. The full, ugly, relieved kind, both hands over my face, completely unconcerned with who was watching. The imaging showed a small bleed near the placenta. They called it an abruption scare and kept me 3 days for monitoring. But the heartbeat was strong. The baby was measuring exactly as she should. Ethan stood in the corner of the room holding the photo in both hands. His phone kept buzzing in his pocket. Even right then, I watched my husband choose which screen deserved his attention, and something inside me went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the painkillers. If you've ever lain in a hospital bed doing the real math on someone, counting who showed up, who checked their phone, who held your hand, and who looked at the door, you know exactly the math I'm talking about. Stay with me. 'Cause what I figured out in that bed changed every single move I made after it. And none of those moves were loud. Ethan was on the phone with Diane's attorney at 1 in the morning. I know because the door to my hospital room had a gap at the frame, and anyone who has ever sat with someone through a long night in a hospital knows that voices carry down those hallways in ways people don't expect. I lay with my eyes closed and I listened. I heard him say she went over the wall. I heard it happened really fast. And then I heard 3 words that turned my stomach colder than anything that evening had. I don't think Mom actually pushed her. Not exactly. Maybe Cassidy was already off balance. Everything was so chaotic. Maybe. Not exactly. Off balance. My husband was reshaping what happened while I lay 10 feet away with a broken wrist and a bruise the exact shape of 2 hands on my chest. I got up when the floor quieted and I stood in the bathroom mirror and I photographed those bruises with my right hand, every angle I could manage, because 11 years of building evidence trails had trained me for exactly this, even when I never expected to need it for myself. Document first. Process it later. When Ethan came back into the room, I asked him plainly who he'd been speaking to. Just family, he said. Everyone is worried. I said, your mother put me here. He flinched like I'd said something unfair. We don't know that for certain, Cass. It was so fast. And there it was, the first fracture. My husband had decided that the safest version of events was the one where nobody had done anything specific, because the only other version required him to stand in front of his mother and choose me. He couldn't do that because Diane didn't just raise Ethan, she funded him, and she had made absolutely sure that those 2 things were the same thing before he was old enough to know the difference. I asked the hospital's patient services rep, not a nurse, not a doctor, for a printed copy of my medical record. She brought it without commentary. I folded it and put it in my bag next to the photo. They discharged me after 3 days of monitoring. Ethan drove me to my house, my mortgage, my porch, my floors, and I noticed he had packed a bag for himself like someone visiting. That afternoon, without calling ahead, Diane sent Kendall as her representative. Kendall arrived with Ronald in tow, sat down on my sofa without being asked, and delivered what she called a proposal that was good for everyone. In the version she'd prepared, I had staged the entire fall, deliberately thrown myself over a 12-foot garden wall while 11 weeks pregnant to manufacture sympathy, create leverage, and crack open the trust. Mom barely made contact, she said. You were already unsteady. You've been making comments about the money for months. I had never said a single word about their money. Not once. Not ever. I sat with my cast in my lap and I felt something settle in me, quiet and absolute, the way it feels in a fraud case when the pattern finally comes clear and you understand exactly what you're looking at. This was not a family in shock. This was a coordinated story, drafted before I left the building, delivered in shifts. They were not protecting themselves from an accusation. They were building a defense before one was filed. I asked one question. If I staged the fall, who broke my wrist? Kendall had nothing. She stood, smoothed her dress, the same automatic gesture from the terrace, and I catalogued it and said, "We're really just trying to help you here, Cassidy." She left her attorney's card on my coffee table. I waited for their cars to be gone from the street. Then I called the one person who had actually run down those stairs. Priya came over with Thai takeout and a yellow legal pad, which is the most Priya combination of things that exists. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and let me be furious for exactly 8 minutes. I could tell she was timing it. Then she said, "Okay. Done. Now let's think." She tapped the pad with her pen. "Here's what they want, Cass. They want you loud. They want you blowing up their phones and calling every cousin on that terrace and screaming that Diane pushed you, because then it's 2 women with 2 stories and the family circles around the one with $12 million and you are the outside woman who couldn't handle losing. Do not be that. You know how we win a fraud case. Paper. Order. Process. You do not convince anyone of anything. You make the records speak. We built the list that night. Hospital records, left wrist fracture, rib contusions, bruising pattern photographed and timestamped within 12 hours. The ultrasound photos. The fetal monitor Doppler strip, the heartbeat at 163 beats per minute, the physical proof of the exact thing Diane had stood up in front of 40 people and called a strategy. And then Priya leaned forward and said the thing that broke the whole case open. "The Monarch is a hotel, Cass." She held my gaze. Hotels record their common areas for liability. That terrace had cameras. I looked at my cast resting on her legal pad. For the first time since I'd gone over that wall, the broken wrist did not feel like damage. Felt like documentation. And right here is where I need to ask you something. If you've made it this far, if you've ever had someone dismiss what you knew to be true because they had more money or more power or more of the room, hit subscribe right now so you see what those cameras actually captured. Because what was on that footage made Diane's own attorneys go quiet. Don't miss it. Ethan came by the following weekend. He said it was for clothes. He had rehearsed something in the driveway. I watched him through the window do it twice before he came in. He sat across from me, reached for my right hand, and told me he loved me and loved the baby and needed this whole thing to stay quiet and manageable. I asked him to define manageable. "The hotel cameras," he said. "The attorneys. The formal process. If you pull that thread, Cass, it doesn't stay contained." And then he said what he'd actually driven over to say. "Please don't burn this family down." I let that sit in the room for a long moment. Then I asked him the question that ended the part of me that was still willing to wait. "What happens to you personally if I don't let it go?" He didn't answer fast enough, and I have spent 11 years knowing that in any negotiation, the first person to stay silent after a question has just told you everything. So I said it for him. Your mother controls the trust. Trust is what keeps your construction firm alive. If you stand next to me, she cuts the loans, your projects collapse, and you are a 38-year-old man starting over from scratch. That's the whole thing. That's what you're protecting." He started to cry. And the hard part, the part I've thought about more than any other part of this, is that I believed the tears. Ethan wasn't cold. He wasn't calculating. He was simply a man who had never once in his life had to find out who he was when the money wasn't there, and he was terrified to learn it at 38. "I am not asking you to choose me," I told him. "I am telling you that you already did. I just need you to stop helping them rewrite what happened." He left without the clothes. I changed the locks Monday morning. With one functional hand, it took nearly an hour. I had the time. The thing that turned this from a painful situation into a winnable case arrived by accident the following Tuesday, the way the best evidence always shows up. My phone buzzed with a group message thread I didn't recognize. 22 members titled Whitmore Family. Kendall had been adding cousins to coordinate something for a family friend, and her thumb moved faster than her attention. She added me, sent one logistics message, and removed me 4 minutes later. But 4 minutes is a long time on a phone that autosaves. The entire thread had already downloaded before she pulled me out. I sat at my kitchen table, I scrolled back to the beginning, and I let my coffee go completely cold. The messages started 12 days before Diane's birthday dinner. Diane to the group, "We need to address the Cassidy situation at the party while we have everyone present." Kendall, "What if she actually is pregnant?" Diane, "Then she can prove it to the family right there. Make it happen in front of everyone." A cousin, "Isn't that a little extreme, Aunt Dee?" Diane, "I will not watch another woman do to this family what was done before. Not again." Kendall, "I'll brief people ahead of time so no one is caught off guard when you bring it up." 14 more messages in that same direction. A plan. A date. Assigned positioning. Rehearsed roles. Terrace was not a moment that got out of hand. It was a scheduled event. I read through it 3 times. I did not respond to anyone on the thread. I did not forward screenshots to a single cousin. I plugged my phone into my laptop, backed the entire thread, timestamps, sender IDs, metadata, into 3 separate locations, and then I called the attorney my colleague Derek had been recommending for 2 weeks. I said the one sentence that started everything: "I have electronically preserved communications that need to be handled through proper legal channels." I want to explain why I didn't just post those messages publicly, because I know that's the question. The pull to do it was real, I will not pretend it wasn't. But 11 years of fraud investigation had trained me to know that evidence mishandled is evidence that can be challenged, excluded, or discredited. If I sent that thread to 22 family members, Kendall's attorneys could argue it was altered. Relatives could be pressured to say they never saw it. And any judge would rightfully question why I'd gone to the internet before I'd gone to counsel. I didn't touch the family. I touched the process. My attorney's name was Marisol Vega, family law and civil litigation, recommended by the orthopedist who'd treated my wrist. Her office had no extra furniture and no decorative warmth, which I respected immediately. I laid everything out the way I'd present a fraud case: timeline, documents, photographs, the thread in order. She read through all of it, set her pen down flat on the desk, and told me 3 things that rearranged the entire situation. First, this is not just a divorce case. In Tennessee, assault and battery against a person you know to be pregnant can be charged as a felony. And the group thread establishes premeditation. She was not reacting in a moment of anger. She was executing a plan she had written down 12 days earlier. Second, the hotel footage. We do not request it from the Whitmore family. We do not depend on your recollection. We subpoena the monarch directly. Hotels maintain recorded footage from common areas for insurance and liability, and they will have filed an incident report the night of the event with staff signatures. That's institutional documentation, untouchable. Third, she slid the prenuptial agreement across the desk. "Cassidy," she said, "this document is the best thing this family ever did for you. It is a legally binding, witnessed, notarized agreement that bars you from any access to the Whitmore Trust under any circumstances. It is their own written proof that you could not have been after the money. The very instrument they designed to protect themselves from you is now your alibi." I sat with that for a long moment. The thing they'd built to wall me out was the thing that proved my name clean. Marisol let the smallest possible smile show. "They built the case against themselves," she said, "and handed it to you in the process." We talked for 2 hours. I left with a plan made of dates and filings rather than feelings. I slept the whole night for the first time since the terrace. Diane's opening move after the divorce filing arrived was the move people with money always make. She tried to buy the quiet. Kendall called 3 days later, voice smooth and bright and professionally warm. Mom wants to put this behind everyone. We are prepared to offer $60,000. Clean dissolution, no fault assigned, you keep the house, everyone moves forward. The pause before you keep the house was deliberate. It was meant to remind me that my house was the ceiling of what I had, while they sat beneath $12 million and called $60,000 generous. I held the phone away from my face for a moment. Then I said, Kendall, I want you to write down my exact answer because Diane is going to ask. I heard her shift. I was never after the money. I have a house I own, a salary I earn, and a prenuptial agreement your family drafted that proves it in writing. I do not want $60,000. I want the truth on the record and I want my child protected. Tell your mother she can keep the rest. Silence. Then Kendall dropped the warmth and I heard what was underneath it. You have no idea what you have just started. The line went dead. She was right that I'd started something. She had the wrong idea about where it was going. I wrote down the date, the time, the offer amount, and her closing words and sent the note to Marisol's office. Then I went to bed. The subpoena worked. The Monarch's legal team complied within 10 business days because hotels do not go to court to protect guests who assault pregnant women on their terraces. Marisol called me to come view the footage with her. She warned me, you don't have to watch it. Court will see it regardless. I watched it anyway. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes because 4 months of people telling me it was something other than what it was had started doing things to my confidence in my own memory. Camera covered the entire south side of the terrace, the garden wall, the drop to the patio, the full corner. No audio, which somehow made it more clinical, more impossible to argue with. I watched myself, visibly pregnant in a green dress, standing my ground at the wall. I watched Diane cross the terrace toward me. I watched Ethan stand directly between us and do nothing, absolutely nothing, for 9 seconds. I had counted them from memory. I counted them again from the footage. 9. And then I watched 2 hands come up and push, clean, direct, both palms, and I watched my body go backward over the stone. The footage did not show a stumble. Did not show a crowd surge or an accident or a woman who lost her footing. It showed a decision made on camera with a timestamp burned into the corner. The incident report came with it. 3 pages, signed by the event supervisor and 2 members of the hotel's service staff. One of them, someone who had never met either of us, who had no stake in what happened to this family, had written in plain, careful language, guest Diane Whitmore physically pushed guest Cassidy Lane over the garden wall during a verbal confrontation. A stranger saw exactly what happened and wrote it down before anyone asked her to. While my husband was in a hospital hallway calling it off balance, a woman in a catering uniform was filing the truth. The lie that the wall pushed me died in a conference room on a quiet Tuesday, and I drove home with one hand on the steering wheel and one hand resting on a belly that was starting to show, and I let myself feel, for the first time since that rooftop, not relief exactly, but the clean, steady certainty that the truth was now larger than anything any of them could do to manage it. Marisol submitted the full package to the district attorney's office. A detective named Torres called me in, composed, unhurried, someone who had clearly read every page before I sat down. She asked me to walk through the evening in sequence. I did dates, times, exact words in order. When I finished, she slid a single sheet across the table. Felony aggravated assault and battery against a pregnant person. Elevated because the group thread proved she had known I was pregnant for 12 days before the party and had used the event to force a confrontation anyway. This was not a snap decision, Detective Torres said. This was scheduled. She looked at me steadily. A trust fund doesn't cancel out a timestamp and 2 eyewitnesses. There was a part of this story I didn't understand until Diane's older sister, I'll call her Vivian, called me one evening about 3 months into the legal process. She was the aunt who had gone pale at the party. The only Whitmore who ever picked up the phone to apologize. She spoke quietly, as if the walls might carry the sound. 30 years ago, she said, Diane's younger brother, she called him Cooper, had married a woman the family never trusted. Within a year, that woman announced a pregnancy. Cooper, completely in love and completely trusting, moved money in her favor, restructured things, put her name on accounts. There was never a child. Or there was, and Cooper wasn't the father. No one ever knew for certain. The marriage fell apart. The woman left with a significant portion of Cooper's inheritance, and Cooper spent the next decade working his way through what was left and never recovered financially or otherwise. He died at 54. After that, Vivian said, Diane had spent close to 15 years rebuilding what the family had lost, turning the scraps into $12 million by grinding, and in the process she had made herself a promise, the kind of promise that stops being a decision and starts being a belief. No woman ever again would do to her son what that woman did to Cooper. She had been carrying that for 30 years. And when she looked at me on that terrace, she genuinely believed she was protecting her family from a repeat of the worst thing that had ever happened to them. I sat with that for a long time after Vivian hung up. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained everything. The certainty on Diane's face, that wasn't cruelty. That was a wound that had turned into a worldview. She had mistaken me for someone who did not exist, and she had been so certain of it that she pushed a pregnant woman over a wall to prove herself right. Understanding why someone hurt you does not mean you hand them back the power to do it again. Cooper's story was real and sad. It was not my fault. And it was not my daughter's problem to inherit. 22 weeks I went in for the anatomy scan. Alone, which was my choice, Priya had offered, and I sent her to work instead. I had already done the hardest moment of this pregnancy in front of 40 strangers on a rooftop. This one was just for me. Technician ran the probe across my belly and the screen filled up with a spine, a profile for chambers of a working heart. A tiny hand that opened and closed like it was practicing for something. "It's a girl," she said. She printed a new photo, crisp and clear, nothing uncertain about it. I tucked it in the same zip pocket with the first one. 2 photos now, the accusation and the proof, riding together. Called Marisol from the parking lot. Something had solidified in me during that scan and I wanted it reflected in the custody filing plainly. I would not be agreeing to any shared arrangement with a household where a documented violent felony against a pregnant woman had taken place, or with a father who had signed a statement calling that felony an accident. Not out of anger. Out of the fact that I was this child's mother and keeping her safe was no longer a feeling I was having about the future. It was a present tense fact. The settlement conference was a room designed for quiet resolutions. Diane agreed to it because she had spent her entire adult life walking into rooms and bending them to her will, and she saw no reason this one would be different. Marisol told me the night before, "She is going to come in as though she's there to negotiate you down. She does not yet know the full shape of what we have laid out in sequence out loud. Let the documents carry it. You stay quiet. The quieter you are, the more weight everything else in that room carries." I laid out my clothes the night before, a simple navy dress, nothing that would distract from a 7-month belly, and set the folder by the door. I was not nervous, and that surprised me. I had spent the worst night of this whole ordeal lying on a stone patio wondering if my daughter was still alive. Conference room was manageable. I got there first on purpose and took the chair with morning light at my back and in their eyes. Marisol sat to my right with the folder closed. When the Whitmores filed in, I watched every single one of them register the belly as they crossed the threshold. Diane in cream, composed, flanked by 2 attorneys. Ronald, somehow smaller than I remembered him. Kendall, who kept her eyes aimed slightly to my left. And Ethan last against the far wall, the posture of a man watching something happen that he knows he should have stopped a long time ago. Diane's lead attorney opened with the standard language about reasonable resolution. Diane cut him off after 3 sentences. She looked directly at me. "Let us not waste time pretending," she said. "You identified a man who comes from money and you made a plan. I have watched this done to this family before. I know exactly what I'm looking at." It was the same speech. The same engine running on the same 30-year-old wound. She had mistaken me for someone from a story that ended before I was born. I said nothing. I had promised Marisol. I rested my left hand, healed now, the cast long gone, flat on the table next to the closed folder, and I let Diane keep building the record of her own certainty. Marisol looked at me. I gave the smallest nod. She opened the folder. One page at a time, in the steady, even voice of someone reading a case file at shift handoff, we laid the story of that night out on the table, Diane's story, the real one, the one that existed in documentation rather than memory. First, the 2 ultrasound photos side by side. The 11-week scan and the 22-week scan, my name and date stamped on both, put down directly in front of Diane. "There is no baby," I said, using her own words back at her. "Only a strategy." A pause. "Her name is going to be Nora. She'll be here in March." Diane's eyes went to the photos. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. Second, the hotel footage on Marisol's laptop. 47 seconds of high-definition, timestamp earned, completely silent video, 2 hands, a pregnant woman, a garden wall, and 9 seconds of a husband doing nothing. We played it once. The room didn't breathe. Third, the Monarch's incident report. 3 pages. 2 staff signatures. Plain language that said exactly what happened. Fourth, the Whitmore family group thread. Printed, tabbed, 12 days of planning with Diane's own message outlined clearly. Make her prove it in front of everyone. And fifth, on top of everything else, the prenuptial agreement. Ronald's document. The thing they had all been so satisfied to have me sign. Marisol laid it at the center of the table. "This agreement," she said, "prohibits Cassidy from accessing the Whitmore Trust under any circumstances. It is your own signed, witnessed, notarized proof that she had no financial motive. You built the instrument that clears her name. You handed it to her at the wedding and told her to sign it twice." I looked at Diane. "On the terrace," I said, "you told me to prove it." I looked at the folder. "I did. It's right here." Diane stared at the prenuptial agreement, the document they had all been so proud of, sitting on top of the footage and the thread and the incident report, serving as the crown of the case against her. I watched the certainty leave her face the way heat leaves a room when you finally open a window. And then she came apart. Diane had never in her life done anything quietly, and she did not start now. The tears came first, aimed at her attorneys, at Ronald, at the room. "You see what she has done," she said. "You see how she has twisted this." When no one moved toward her, when no one reached to hand her the victory she was used to being handed, the anger surfaced underneath. She stood. Her chair scraped. She pointed across the table at me, her hand shaking. "I was protecting this family," she said, her voice rising. "Do you understand what I rebuilt with my own 2 hands? Do you know what happened to Cooper? Do you know?" Her lead attorney was on his feet saying her name. She did not stop. She turned on Ronald, who had spent 30 years in the safest seat in the room. She turned on Kendall, who had done exactly as she was instructed. She turned on Ethan, folded against the far wall, and said words she could never take back, that he was useless, that all of them were useless, that she was the only one who had ever, and there the sentence ran out. She was standing in a conference room with every person who had ever mattered to her staring at the tabletop instead of at her, having made the case against herself in front of the only people whose opinion she had spent a lifetime working to control. I sat with my left hand flat on the table, my daughter moving slowly under my navy dress, and I said nothing at all. She had done every piece of my remaining work for me. Calmest person in that room had already won. She just had to let Diane finish proving it. Here is what that folder actually produced, because I know some of you are waiting for this part and you deserve to hear it in plain language. The felony charge held. Premeditation across 12 days in writing. Hotel footage. 2 independent eyewitnesses. Medical documentation of injury to a pregnant person. The district attorney made it clear there would be no quiet handling of this case because of who the family was. Diane entered a guilty plea that kept her out of prison but placed a permanent felony conviction on her record, the first thing in her 60 years that money could not undo. And the Whitmore family trust's own charter allowed co-trustees to remove a trustee upon felony conviction. So the woman who shoved me over a wall to protect her control of $12 million lost that control because she shoved me over the wall. She designed the mechanism that removed her. She just never imagined she would be the one to trigger it. The civil settlement covered my medical costs, the wrist procedure, lost income, and documented damages, paid by Diane personally and classified as my separate property under the exact prenuptial agreement her family had required. I kept my house, which had always been mine. Sole custody was established in a temporary order before Nora was even born, citing the felony conviction and Ethan's signed false statement. I have not closed the door on supervised contact for him someday, if he becomes the kind of man worth knowing. But he stood frozen for 9 seconds on a terrace, and he signed his name to a lie on a porch, and people show you exactly who they are when the cost of honesty is real. I want to tell you about Kendall before I close because her piece of this explains something important about all of it. In Discovery, the trust's distribution structure came out. A new grandchild created a new beneficiary branch, which meant Kendall's share of the $12 million got materially smaller. Nora was not a joy to Kendall. Nora was a line item that cost her money. Kendall had coordinated a planned public humiliation of a pregnant woman, her own sister-in-law, because my daughter represented a reduction in her inheritance. When I understood that fully, I stopped being angry at Kendall specifically. She was just the clearest proof of what that money had done to all of them over the years. It had turned a baby into a financial threat. And no amount of trust funds can fix what that does to a person's ability to love anything that doesn't have a return on it. Nora was born in March. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, absolutely furious about being outside, and so clearly herself from the very first minute that I laughed through the tears. I named her Nora May Lane. Sole custody was finalized 3 weeks after she arrived. The divorce was final before she was a month old. Diane is not in her life. Ronald sends a card on holidays that I set aside without opening. Kendall has distanced herself from Diane, not from conscience, from calculation. A felony on the family name costs more than a grandchild. I keep both ultrasound photos in a frame on my dresser. The grainy 11-week one and the crisp 22-week one, right next to each other, the first thing I see every morning when I get up for work. I am still a forensic accountant. I still document everything. The front porch still tilts 5 degrees to the left. Keep meaning to fix it. I probably won't for another year, and I am genuinely at peace with that. Priya is Nora's godmother. She comes over on her days off and takes the baby so I can sleep, and sometimes we sit on that tilted porch with coffee and don't talk about any of it, which is the very best kind of friendship. She told me once, rocking Nora in the kitchen, that she had been more scared in that patio garden than she let me see in the moment. I told her I knew. She'd held up the photo, I said. That was everything. People ask me all the time, in comments and messages, whether I ever wanted to scream at Diane. To finally, openly, let her hear the full weight of what she had done to me. And the honest answer is yes. For about 1 second on that terrace, that urge was there and it was real. But that scream was the trap she had built. She had spent 30 years knowing how to beat a woman who yelled. She had no preparation at all for a woman who sat still, built her folder, and waited for the right room. I came from nothing and I built something real, and nobody gets to call that something a scheme and walk away from it clean. Not anymore. Nora is going to grow up knowing that her mother stayed calm when it cost the most, kept every receipt, and walked out of that conference room with her name and her daughter intact. That is the only inheritance that has ever mattered to me. If this story resonated with you today, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who had more money but less truth, I want you to do 3 things right now. First, share this video with one person who needs to hear it. Second, drop your city and the time where you're listening in the comments. I want to know where Silent Revenge is reaching today. And third, hit subscribe because next week's story is going to hit just as hard, and you don't want to come in mid-conversation. 1 rooftop. 1 lie. 1 folder that spoke louder than all of it. I'll see you in the next one. This is Silent Revenge.